Welcome into the Skinny Podcast. It's the weekly Potpourri edition. I'm Richard Skinner, Local12.com digital sports columnist and editor with Rick Boring. As always, it's presented by Blake the Attorney Maislin. We got lots to get to on kind of a non-football week, if you will, with the Super Bowl still a week away. But as always, a ton to get to. Rick, let's get to it.
Yeah, Skinny, let's start with the Bengals as Al Golden was introduced as the new defensive coordinator. I know Bengals media, yourself got the chance to talk to him and Zach Taylor. So I guess my first question is, what were your takeaways from that meeting with Al Golden and Zach Taylor?
No nonsense. I love one of his quotes about, I don't live in the gray area. He wants to make things pretty much black and white for the players. And it sounds like he wants to keep things simple for the players and just let them play fast. He talked about, his role of developing players, which is important. He played a bunch of freshmen this past year at Notre Dame, apparently. He talked about that. And if you're going to play freshmen, you better develop them, especially on a team that got all the way to a national championship game. So, listen, I'm not here to pan the hire because he doesn't have NFL coordinator experience. I'm not here to praise the hire just because of what he did at Notre Dame. The thing I do know is this: Zach Taylor better get this one right, because I don't think he's going to get a chance to get one right again. This one has to be the right hire.
I heard people commenting about, it's not nepotism necessarily, but the idea that Zach Taylor is just hiring his buddy, or the Bengals are getting a discount. They're going after a guy that they're familiar with, and that's why they went after Al Golden and didn't do a quote-unquote real search around the rest of the NFL and college ranks. Skinny, I would argue, to your point that you just made, Zach Taylor is in a spot where his back is against the wall with this defensive coordinator hire. He has to have someone that he trusts. He has to have someone that he knows he's going to be on the same page with. He can't go out and get someone that, okay, the resume is great, but we didn't jive and it just didn't work out, and we wasted a year and a half, 2 years before we ever figured that out and decided to move on from each other. That will be the end of Zach Taylor's career as a head coach in the NFL, or at least with the Cincinnati Bengals, and for the foreseeable future. So I really don't have a problem with him going after a guy that he's familiar with, that he has a relationship with, and that he trusts. That really doesn't bother me in this situation. I think that's what most people would do.
Yeah, me either. Listen, he worked for the Bengals for 2 years in 2020 and 2021. So he's a part of that Super Bowl staff. Zach Taylor knows his work ethic, knows, how he works. Again, the familiarity is he even admitted it. He said it wasn't the driving force in the hire, but it certainly didn't hurt. And familiarity was talked about a bunch in that press conference between both. And again, the fact that he had 2 successful years at Notre Dame as a coordinator, I think does say something. I know it's not the NFL, but it does say something. And to the main overriding point of this is, again, the hire for Zach Taylor was made because he knows he has to get the defense turned around, because he's not going to get it. He's not getting another chance at this. If this doesn't work out playoff wise either this year or next, barring crazy circumstances from an injury standpoint, it will be Zach Taylor who will be on his way out. So you think he's just hiring a guy because he's a friend or he's familiar with him? That's the only reason? It better not be, because it'll be the wrong hire and he'll be out of a job. He's not going to risk his career for that.
Right. And I think a lot of people don't like to admit it, but they would do the same thing in that instance. When your back's against the wall and you've got to get it right, you're going to go with someone that you're comfortable with and that you trust. And in this case for Zach Taylor, that happened to be Al Golden. And Al Golden, by the way, has some chops. Like, he did just lead one of the best defenses in all of college football to the national championship game. So it's not like he's coming off a questionable year, or you're grabbing him out of some obscure location or something. I mean, he is a prominent name in the sport right now, and a guy who is going to get a lot of consideration.
And he's got previous coordinator experience at Virginia back in the early 2000s. That led to him getting head coaching jobs at Temple and Miami of Florida. This isn't just some no-name guy. This is a guy who was a head coach of 2 Division I football programs, was a defensive coordinator of a national runner-up team, and has coached in the NFL as a position coach. And so, again, this wasn't just a guy who's a neighbor of Zach Taylor's that he hired, although he is a neighbor of Zach Taylor's because he never moved from here. But yeah, Again, I don't know if it's a great hire. I can't say it's a bad hire. We won't know till we see the proof. So anybody who pans this or praises this, you're just stabbing at something, in my opinion. But I go back to the bottom line is Zach Taylor better get it right or have gotten it right, and that's going to be the determining factor of whether this was a good hire or not.
Yeah, you and Trags went into more detail on the nitty gritty of what he's going to need to change and all of that on the podcast you guys did earlier this week. So I won't go too much farther into that, but I do want to ask you, in terms of the position groups, I think we would agree that you're not just going to be able to remake this entire defense in
Right.
1 year. Like the way we look at it now, it's like you need help at defensive line, you need help at linebacker, you need help in the secondary. But the reality is you're going to be able to address maybe one of those position groups well through free agency, and you'll probably draft well at one of the other position groups, but you're not going to be able to address all of them equally. What position group do you think he most needs to address on the defensive side first? And which position group do you think he'll have to say, we'll make it work with what we've got right now?
Yeah, the one that you may have to make it work with what you've got is the safety group. I just don't know if you can remake that and maybe have to add a starting linebacker depending on what they do with Jermaine Pratt if they cut him. And you also need an edge rusher. And the hope would have been that Miles Murphy can become that guy. He's not done anything really in his first 2 years. Maybe they saw enough out of Joseph Osai that they re-sign him. He's slated to be a free agent, and it probably won't cost you much to re-sign him. And maybe you can get a little bit more out of him, but I think you certainly need more there. And you still need more interior pass rush. I mean, Sheldon Rankins was brought here to do that, and he was a complete and total bust. So there's a lot of spots, Rick. And so to me, I mean, I'm going to work front to back, in my opinion, and the back end of that is the safety group, and see if you can make do with the Jordan Battle, Geno Stone tandem. Al was asked on Monday about, if you've taken a look at the roster, what do you think? And it's a fair question. I kind of knew what the answer was going to be. I think we all did. It was a fair question to ask. And he said, listen, that's literally what I'm doing, is taking a dive into this. Maybe he sees something that we don't, or that he thinks he can get out of those guys on the back end, or maybe he sees Jermaine Pratt and says, just a little tweak here, I can make him the player he was for me in 2021 as opposed to the player he is right now in 2024. So I'm interested to see who they retain and who they don't. And I think that'll answer the question. I am going to do on Friday. The Athletic has that great exercise that Paul Dehner Jr. puts up of how you can redo a roster and go through the salary cap. They actually have a kind of a worksheet you can do. I'm going to be interested to see where I land financially, to see what you can do. That's the other part. Once you sign Jamar, although his money really won't kick in until next year, if you will, from a salary cap burden standpoint. What happens if you end up signing T? What money is now left over? If you extend Trey Hendrickson, how much is left over? Maybe it's not enough to remake anything, that you got to make do with what you got through the draft. That might be a sobering exercise once I get done with it, to be honest with you.
Skinny, some other Bengals news that came out this week was that Eric All will miss the entire 2025 season due to the knee injury he suffered this past year. Obviously, he has an extensive injury history going back to his college days. It is terrible for him personally, but also from a Bengals standpoint, what does this mean for how they're going to handle the tight end position this offseason?
Yeah, I thought all along they were going to try to re-sign Mike Gesicki, and I'm still in that camp. And so if you do that, you still have Drew Sample, you still have Tanner Hudson. They brought up Cam Grandy. I thought Eric All was going to be the perfect 3-down tight end for them, and hopefully he will be starting in 2026. But I still think if you re-sign Mike Gesicki, even though All did play in 9 games last year, you're kind of in an okay boat. I mean, Gesicki had a really good second half of the year, especially as a receiver. Again, then you got Sample as the blocker, Hudson as a backup pass catcher, if you will, and Grandy actually started a handful of games because they like to do weird first plays, and he's in there to block mostly. They did re-sign him a week or so ago, and maybe they re-signed him with the full knowledge that they weren't going to have Eric All for this season. So I don't think it's a huge blow, and I say that with the thought that I think Eric Hall had a chance to be a really, really good 3-down player for them. But again, you only had him for 9 games this year.
Yeah. And then, Skinny, another thing that happened this week was Kelsey Conway of the Enquirer spoke to Duke Tobin. Got quotes on Jamar Chase and Trey Hendrickson specifically, and how they're trying to handle those situations this offseason. The big takeaway here, and I'll read through the quotes quickly, but the big takeaway for me was it feels very much like they understand the Jamar Chase situation. They want to get it done as quickly as possible. The Trey Hendrickson situation, they're kind of setting us up for Trey and his party don't seem like they want to play ball with us, and we don't know where it's going from here. So we'll see how it plays out. Here was the quote on Jamar Chase. It's a priority for us, Tobin said. It's something we feel like there's a framework to work off of. Should be a pretty easy framework to work off of. Guys in his position have recently redone contracts. We believe in Jamar. He's very important to us. The other guys that have done contracts are very important to their teams. So we believe there's a real framework to work off of. I would expect that we could come together on something that makes sense for both sides. Then on Trey Hendrickson, Duke Tobin said, has he earned a pay raise and a bump and an extension? He has. We're cognizant of that, and we will give that to him. But whether we agree on what that looks like is what is yet to be determined. So give me your thoughts on those two quotes, Skinny.
Yeah, I mean, sorry for starters. I think that they do realize that they have to sign Jamar Chase no matter what. Now, again, are we now into the $42 million average value? I mean, we exceeded the Justin Jefferson money at this point by a significant margin or by a little margin. And the Trey one to me has always been they were going to offer a 1 year extension. He's under contract through 2025 through this season. You extend him by a year, you give him a healthy signing bonus to be able to prorate that, and you feel like you're done with it. I get Trey's side not wanting to be done with it. He's looking to cash in one more time. He's 30 years old. That's kind of the line of demarcation, right, in this league for guys. If you don't want to get guys into multi-year deals beyond their 30s, now, Trey Anderson could be a completely different animal. I mean, he takes care of himself. He still looks great. He looks physically great. In fact, he looks better than ever. So could that guy get a 3-year deal in your mind? Maybe. But again, then are you going to be tied up to a 33-year-old guy that suddenly at age 33 it goes? I think it's a real quandary. And I don't know if I see fault in either side in how this transpires. But it does sound like, to your point, they're kind of setting everybody up to may not be able to get this done. And then we're going to have to make a tough decision with Trey.
I realize there's one game in particular that is a strong rebuttal to what I'm about to bring up. And there's probably a few games that you would point out. But here would be my question to you about trying to figure out the Trey Hendrickson situation. Was the Bengals defense any good this year?
It was not.
Was Trey Hendrickson the best pass rusher in the league, or at least had the most sacks out of anybody in the NFL?
He did.
So if you give Trey Hendrickson all this money and he performs as well as he possibly can, which means he gets more sacks than anyone else in the NFL, which I would think is a pretty damn high level of performance from him. Is he actually good enough to make a difference? Like Jamar Chase, when you pay him, he wins games for you. Clearly, he is the difference maker on the field. Joe Burrow, same thing. With Trey Hendrickson, your defense still sucked with him out there. And I love him. He was awesome. He dominated a game or two, but your defense overall still sucked with Trey Hendrickson playing as well as he can possibly play. I just don't know if I can give him that type of money for a guy that, even when he's amazing, and I loved watching him, he didn't really impact wins and losses all that much.
Yeah, I'm kind of with you in that regard. I mean, the sacks are great and all that, and he obviously led the league in that category. But in what games did those sacks make a difference, right? I mean, there was a couple, certainly the Las Vegas game, but I think you beat Las Vegas without him having 3 or 4 sacks.
Exactly.
So yeah, I mean, I get the other faction that says, how can you let go of the best player in maybe the league, the defensive player of the year? Well, there's a lot of factors involved in all of these things. And to your point, who impacts wins and losses the most? And I just don't know. It never feels like he does. And I hate to do that because the numbers should speak for themselves, and they just don't. He's also not a great end against the run, and that has to be fact. Everybody sees the sack number, right? Got 70.5 sacks. Yeah, well, you didn't do all that great against the run according to PFF. I know they're not the be-all, end-all, but you're basically middle of the pack as a run defender, maybe even less than middle of the pack as a run defender. That teams do run the ball. That does factor into the equation.
Yeah, and like, again, I love Trey Hendrickson. This is not meant to be a right. Trey Hendrickson has not played decision. Well or anything like that. But there is, like, when you're talking about spending this much money, you do have to go a little bit farther. And for me, to that point, I don't think he's the type of Myles Garrett or one of those dominant TJ Watt type of players that everyone panics about when they have to play him and they game plan against him and he completely destroys everything they want to do. I think he's a guy who is a really, really good pass rusher who puts up really good numbers, but at the end of the day, he's not going to dominate a game and change it in the way that some of the truly, truly elite defensive players do. And even if you want to argue that he does do that, well, okay, but the Bengals defense still stunk last year with him being great. So I just don't think you can commit that much money to him.
And it goes back to this. Everybody talks about just pay him. You can't pay them all, man. You cannot.
Right.
I mean, in a perfect world, it would be great, but you just can't. Can you do it and not have a good football team otherwise? Sure. That's kind of where you're at the moment. You have to make that decision.
And let's not forget about what he did last offseason, right after they had given him an extension and more money. And then last year, it's like, well, I need more. I'm not gonna play if you don't give me more. I'm gonna request a trade. He never did any of that stuff, but he did threaten it. At this point, it's kind of like, well, whatever, Trey. We'll just, we'll figure out how we have to figure it out, and we'll let you know what we do. We will talk about the Super Bowl next week. We'll do the preview next week because that game isn't going to happen for another week and a half. But the Eagles and the Chiefs did make it to the game this year. Any thoughts on the conference championships?
Yeah, I mean, Bengals played both of those teams, and I thought Philly was the best team. Them and Baltimore were the two best teams. I thought the Bengals played this season. And so Philly getting there's not a surprise. And God love Kansas City, man. They can beat you 17-16. They can beat you 27-26. They just beat you. I can't explain it. I really can't, because it's not Pat Mahomes throwing for 50 touchdowns anymore. It's
No,
Pat
it's
Mahomes
refs
making enough
throwing flags.
plays. It's the refs. It's the refs and the Chiefs defense, right?
Yeah, I mean, in all seriousness, the ref thing is funny. I get the complaints. I get why everyone is mad about it. It is truly incredible how everything falls into place for them every single time they need it
Yeah.
to. Whether it be the other team screwing up easy instances, or the refs screwing up calls, or Pat Mahomes being amazing, or the defense making whatever it is, every single time they need it in a big moment, everything falls into place for them. It's truly incredible to watch.
I mean, nobody's ever three-peated. That's why it's extremely hard to do. Here they are on the cusp of doing that, and we'll talk next week. Can they do it? We'll see.
Yeah, we'll preview that game on next week's show. Real quick on college football before we switch gears here to the Red Skinny. What do you make of Ohio State defensive coordinator Jim Knowles leaving for Penn State?
Yeah, it was interesting. Don't remember during the season, wasn't it a point where Ryan Day was going to call the defense instead of Jim Knowles, and that
Right
became a
after
big
the
deal?
Oregon loss. That's
Yeah,
what I keep going back to. I think there's a rift between them because of that.
yeah. That's what it feels like to me.
Yeah, and then you also have the fact that he and Chip Kelly were clearly good friends. So it's like you bring in one guy who came in after Jim Knowles. He clearly becomes your right-hand man. Jim Knowles, I think, was feeling a little slighted. And then you also have the situation with the fan base. They lose to Oregon. He gets thrown under the bus. The whole coaching staff needs to be let go. They lose to Michigan. Same situation. Everyone wants all of them fired. I don't blame anyone on that staff who looks at it and goes, hey, we accomplished what we set out to accomplish. We got the title. It's only downhill from here with the fan base. They're not going to just be like, okay, that's enough. Like, we're not going to be able to do enough going forward to keep these people happy. So I'm getting out while the getting's good.
Yeah, no, I'm with you. Part of me thought Ryan Day may do the same thing.
Yeah.
Thanks for checking out the Local 12 YouTube channel. Click the links and tap subscribe to get notified anytime we post.